Forward, everybody. Okay, welcome to Satsang, everybody. It's a beautiful day. We're in Hawaii. We had a storm last night. I was saying that earlier, which means that sometimes the bandwidth here isn't quite as good as it could be. So if you have any problems hearing me, one of the things you can do is knock your own video down, and it'll increase the bandwidth. I will keep mine on. Probably, I don't know, mainly because they probably want to, they're going to want to see me anyway. So the recording will have me and and it will have, and instead of all the people like I usually do, it'll just be me. How's that for ego? Isn't it great? So anyway, I wanted to just start out. The other day I was talking to somebody, and they told me, they said, I've listened to a lot of what you say, and I cannot reduce it to any set of teachings or a teaching. And I had to kind of chuckle because about the same time I looked at a Papa G video. Papa G is a fairly well-known saint, enlightened master who lived in India for years. I think he died in about 1997 or maybe 2000, something along that line, and was a very sweet man. If you ever get a chance to watch Papa G, or also known as Punjaji, he's a lot of fun. Big guy, laughed a lot, loved cricket, and very sweet man. So anyway, but Papa G said, he says, I don't have any teachings. And I always used to love that, because here's how wisdom works. Wisdom does not lie in the stories that we tell. Now, I talk a lot about story, and understanding story is important. But understanding story is a little bit like understanding a bull. When you deal with a bull, one of the things you really want to know is which end are the horns on. At least most people that I know that deal with bulls will usually tell you that's a really important thing to understand. If you've ever seen a bull, you probably understand that all on your own. Which end are the horns on? Really, really good thing to know. And that's why understanding story is really important to know, because not only do we step into a story, and not only do we use story, but then we see that the stories are not who we really are. That what we really are is awareness through consciousness. That's really what it is. And so what is wisdom? Isn't that interesting? Wisdom is what flows through you as a conduit or a part of consciousness. If you can imagine that all consciousness is the energy of movement, the energy of activity, and what it is doing, it's acting through you. That's all consciousness is. And the question is, do you think you're the story that you've created once you see what consciousness creates? Or can you see that you're not the story, but consciousness itself? And so the spiritual journey is really just a function of, I'm going to mute you down here so we don't have noise. Anyway, all that is you are moving through to understand that you're not the story. Now, why is it that we think we're the story? Well, we really don't know anything else. Consciousness itself is always looking to figure out what it is. That's the nature of consciousness. And so far, what it seems to figure it out, and is communicating to everybody is that we are the story. But the problem with believing that we are the story is that we start to feel in bondage. We start to feel that we're separated from who we really are. So that's what happens. So what's wisdom? Well, wisdom is really having no teaching at all, Because if you have a teaching, who has a teaching? The story has a teaching. And so you really believe that that story is going to have its teaching, and it comes in and says, these are my teaching. Well, the problem with that is that that's a one size fits all approach, isn't it? So you know, and I know that wisdom is the absolute delivery in the moment of the perfect thing. And how does that happen? It's when consciousness simply moves through you. So I can sit here and I can ask myself some really great questions. It's always interesting before satsang, because you all know that I can talk for a long time, and we'll get to the questions here in a while when questions come up. But my grandfather used to say, I never met a conversation I didn't like. And yet before I do satsang, there's always this moment that comes to me, and here's what the voice says. It says, Alan, you really don't have anything to say. There's nothing in there. And so that message always comes through. And what happens is then I just sit here and go, yeah, but I'm going to do satsang, and then we'll see what wants to come through. And what comes through is what comes through. And so that's what happens here. That's what's going on. That's what's going on in front of you. I had a beautiful experience this morning, because we always look for the synchronicity in our life, right? So we say, oh, look at that synchronicity. Isn't that cool that happened? Your entire life is a synchronicity. There is not one event in your life that happens that is not pointed to your own awakening. That's all that happens. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what that thing is. It can be Paolo and I wolfing down a cherry pie. That would work. It could be Amir and I riding a bike. That would work. It could be Julian and I. If you've ever seen the Muppets, if you ever seen the old men sitting on the fence talking to each other, that's what Julian and I do. It could be that. It could be for the 1,000th time when Abuela reminds me of something that I've forgotten. That could be that. Every single thing. It's all synchronicity. So this morning I had a little check-in with Dilraj. And so Dilraj and I were speaking. And it's always funny when Dilraj and I are speaking, it always seems like Janet's there with us. I don't know why, but it does. It just seems like she's there. So this is about an hour before satsang, and turns out Janet, like me, is still struggling with a time change. And so all of a sudden, who would appear in our room that can enter but Janet? And in that moment, both Dilraj and I started to chuckle, because what angel would want to come into the room? Well, we would want in the room more than having Janet in the room. And so Janet came in the room, all concerned, of course, that somehow or another she was interrupting our meeting. And Dilraj and I were thinking we had a visit from an angel. So it was a completely different story. And you can see how stories change, right? So we had really bad connectivity at that point in time. So now we have to convince Janet through the bad connectivity that nothing could be a more wonderful moment than her coming into our meeting. That was really the most wonderful thing that could be. And so we all had to change our story. But in that moment, we didn't know that was going to happen. And we could all say, what a beautiful synchronicity. But you see, every single moment in life is a synchronicity. No matter what it is, it's an absolute moment to be embraced. So realize that every moment is exactly like that. And there is no teaching. The only thing that we are attempting to do is point to who you really are. That is the only thing. And I'm going to do a little exercise with everybody in a minute here, and we're going to just play a little bit with that, and then we'll run along. So I have a question. If consciousness is benevolent and creation is loving, why does consciousness allow misidentification with body and mind that creates so much suffering and unhappiness for so many people? Great one, huh? So if you think about what we do, and hey, Winston, I'm going to mute you down here, brother, just to kind of get the noise out of the room. Anyway, so whenever you look at a question, I'm going to give you guys the big secret on how to understand how to deal with a question. Whenever you see a question, the first thing you ask yourself is there an assumption in that question? First thing you ask yourself, what's the assumption in the question? Because if you answer a question and you accept the assumption that's in there, then the answer to your question has to live or has to rely on that assumption. You have no choice. So the mind itself is like that, right? The mind looks out. We've talked about this before. The pig's running across the field. I extract the pig and I make a story out of that. So human living is entirely dependent on how that story is extracted. And we all have a way that we agree with. So guess what? Stories themselves are based on the assumption of how an individual I called Alan or Lachey or Trayshawn extract that story. So that's always an assumption that we make, that the story we extracted can now have questions asked about it. But the first thing you may want to do is go look at the story itself before you attempt to answer a question. What's the story itself? So look at what Julian has brought us. If consciousness is benevolent and creation is loving, right? Well, is consciousness benevolent and is creation loving? What if the answer to that was no? What if, in order for creation to be creation and consciousness to be consciousness, what if everything that was possible needed to be displayed? How else would you know what loving was if you didn't know what the other thing was as well? Right? How could that possibly happen? So when you look out there, the first thing you notice, consciousness is the principle of activity and motion. And it includes all activity and it includes all motion. That's what it does. And consciousness itself is trying to figure out what it is. In order for it to figure out what it is, it needs to include everything. So what happens is consciousness misidentifies itself. It doesn't know any better. All it is the principle of activity. And what it does is it does what we all do. So you notice that all of the people who are conscious believe that they are separate, and they believe that they are an autonomous author of their own existence. That's what they believe, right? And that belief is what creates the whole concept of separation. And it creates the whole concept of good and evil. And it creates the whole idea of suffering. Because earlier, when I told you that consciousness arises, right? It comes and you are already part of it in every single moment. Remember I said, synchronicity is in every single moment. And if all that you realize is the moment and you come together, right? Have you ever looked out there and noticed that there's nothing out there? It's only just you because you've moved out of all the rest of the stuff. I haven't. I've never arrived there. In my entire life, every time I look out there, guess what? The rest of everything is there. It's always there, right? That's the nature. That is the absolute nature of how things are. You come with everything else. It's only in your mind that you extract yourself and create a story. So what can suffer? Only your story. You think you're a story and you think that there is suffering. And that's what happens. Now, when all there is wisdom, when wisdom is moving through you, then there is always a sense of permanent peace. So there's a story about a little old man. He was a wise man in the village, and he wore these really crappy clothes, like most of us do. You ever notice that that a lot of the older wise ones, the men and the women who are wise, that it looks like we get our wardrobe out of a dumpster? Yeah, I don't know why that is, but it is. So this was the case in this particular situation, where the wise man wore some really crappy clothes. And he came into a situation where the kids were playing in the neighborhood, and the kids started to make fun of him. You know how the bullying happens. And this man thought, well, that's kind of fun. And so he started making fun of himself as well. You know, he thought, what the heck? Let's have some fun with this. I do dress like a bum. So what the heck? Let's have a little fun. So he started playing with the kids and making fun of himself. Well, the kid that started it all got a little irritated with that. And so his response to that was to begin throwing rocks at the old man. And of course, you know, a few of the rocks hit, and pretty soon the old man had a few spots that were bleeding and everything. And the village got very upset about that, and everybody came running. And they cleaned him all up and got him all back to where he looked as good as he could look. And they asked him, and they said, what do you want to do about this? This is just really an egregious problem. And he sat for a minute and he said, you know, here's the way I look at it. He said, you know, I showed up, some kids were having fun with a joke. I joined in. Then some hands started to throw some rocks, and that happened. And he said, and then a bunch of beautiful hands reached out and they cleaned up everything. And he said, and here we sit. He says, I don't see a problem at all. That's what happened. That's exactly what happened. No pretentiousness, no need for any story to have its moment of retribution or its moment of whatever it thought it had coming, but rather just a noticing of what happened. That's what happened. And in the end, a beautiful experience. Everybody in the village, they were cleaning him up and bringing him back to this wonderful place. Now he had a few cuts and bruises, and that happens in life. But that's a different story than we're used to, because normally the story says, wait a minute, I've been injured. I have been somehow, in some particular way, I've been wrong. Only a separate story can feel that, because it's been wronged by somebody else, right? In separation, there are other people that do bad things to you. So I always ask the question, when you're ready for it now, because a lot of times what happens is you have to work with your own story until you're ready for this particular question. But someone will say, I've been injured. Now remember, we always meet them where they are. But the absolute answer to I've been injured is, well, that's not possible. How is that even possible? Right? And if you look deeply into your own distress and your own injury, believe it or not, it dissolves. I know it sounds like that's a really funny thing, but it does. Because when you look at the I that you are and the story that you are, it actually will dissolve if you look at it carefully enough. And then you have to say, well, gee, I'm part of all that is. That's one way of saying it. All that is who I am. And how is it possible that I could be injured? What could be injured? The Alan story can be injured, because Alan has mistakenly believed that that story is who he is. So Alan could propose that he was injured. And then all the other stories have to somehow or another make that different than it used to be. And in so doing, they'll probably injure a whole bunch of other people. And so in the end, it seems like folks getting injured is just part of the experience of living life. Now, you see it every day. So the whole idea that consciousness is, how did Julian say it? Benevolent? I don't know. That doesn't seem very benevolent to me. It seems like a lot of folks are feeling hurt, feeling this or feeling that. Now, do we actually do things with the stories? We do. Why do we do that? Because what we're trying to do is relax the story. Whenever you can relax the story, another story can take its place, and you could also fall into consciousness itself. One of the two things have a possibility of happening. That's just the nature. That's the nature of moving towards awakening itself. So how could Gandhi walk to the ocean and say, I'm absolutely going to be in a nonviolent position? Because he could see there was nobody to be hurt. All he did by being violent was confirm the fact that he was separate from everybody else. But if in a nonviolent way, he simply walked to the ocean and everybody around him followed him there, in one nonviolent act, everything that needed to happen happened. Nobody got hurt, no further injuries were created, and there it was. That's why when somebody talks about the principle of nonviolence, it's a really kind of an interesting thing if you look at it, because at its highest form, it's just the recognition that there's nobody to do violence to. In Gandhi, if somebody had thrown rocks at him and made him bleed and then they cleaned him up, could have been like the old wise man in the village who said, hey, you know, some rocks were thrown, I got cleaned up, that's what happened, let's continue our march to the sea. And that would have been how Gandhi would have approached it. So you don't have to make yourself be nonviolent. You just simply need to see that nonviolence is the embrace of the understanding that you aren't the story. And that's what happens there. All right. I don't know. I'm hoping we got that. So Janet, is consciousness really nothing and only something when an ego identifies with it? Okay. So remember that, Janet, when I answer these questions, what I'm doing is telling a story. Okay. It's a concept or a story. And so I'm making up a way to try to address the question that you've given me. And underneath it, what the possibility is that consciousness and Janet become one thing themselves, that moment of collapse happens, and that the recognition that you are consciousness and consciousness is you will occur. So consciousness really is nothing. Let me explain how I would say that. When they talk about the Big Bang, what they're talking about is the moment that nothing becomes something. That's the whole idea of the Big Bang. So in the beginning, in the story I would tell you, I would say all there is pure awareness. And that's who you are, is pure awareness. Right? Janet and Alan and Sabrina and Julian and Justine and Winston and everybody who's in the room beyond, we're all just pure awareness. Now we think we're separate things, but what we really are is pure awareness. And what happened is that from that activity, basically pure awareness sitting in non-activity, that it moved to activity. And in that movement, consciousness leapt out. What was created in the Big Bang, if you use the scientific story, is consciousness, right? So all it is the principle of movement. So it really isn't anything other than humans were given this wonderful gift, and it's called intellect. Ramesh used to call that the dubious gift of intellect, because as he saw it, intellect created a lot more problems than it solved. So even though it was a gift, it was a dubious gift. And what the intellect does is it takes that principle of activity and it forms it into a story. It cognizes, as we say, which just means it takes stuff and makes a story out of it. And then the story that it created is that you are something, and what you learned with that you are something is that you are a story, and you believe that that story is you, and that's what happens in that particular situation. So when you say, is consciousness really nothing? Probably a better way to say that is, am I really nothing? Yes, the nothing is that you are pure awareness. And only when something appears within awareness does awareness even track it, right? If nothing appears within awareness, if there's nothing that arises, there's not even a tracking. So then you really are that nothingness. And it's only something when the ego identifies it. And that's a great way to say it. Yes. All there is consciousness. You hear me say that all the time. What I'm saying is that everything that exists is consciousness. And that's what it does. So that kind of comes into the next piece, which is, what is the function of consciousness? Right? So if I told you that consciousness has no function, that would be a bit confusing, because obviously consciousness is out there. You can see all the movement in front of us. It's appearing in our consciousness as this whole world. We perceive it. That happens. But here's another way to say the same thing, Trayshawn. The function of consciousness is to reveal itself to itself. What happens when consciousness comes into being is that it creates a world in which consciousness can function. The principle of activity needs a place to function. So what's that place? We call it space, right? Now, in order for us to see that functioning within space, we need this other thing called duration. So we need space and we need time. Remember, Einstein concluded that those are the same thing, that there was a platform called space-time, and those are the same thing. It was a continuum, right? And so consciousness occupies the location of space and the location of time. That's what it does. And however you want to say that, that's what it does. And its function is to reveal itself to itself. So think about your own life, Trayshawn, because you're just a piece of consciousness. Look at what you've been doing for 16 years. You've been trying to figure out who and what the heck you are, and what is all this stuff happening in front of you, right? That's what you've been trying to do. Now you've been taught that the way to do that is to attach meaning to the pieces that you see. So anything that you perceive, you attach meaning to those, and that separates it from any other piece that you see. I see blue and I see red, right? One's called blue, one's called red. Now red and blue are different because you can see those as different things. And so you wander around attaching all these meanings. And that's what we learn to do around consciousness. But what that does is it makes us think that somehow or another Trayshawn is this separate entity, rather than being part of everything that is all by itself. That's what happens, right? So basically what somebody like me is going to do is say, listen, the deeper reality is that what you see yourself as is simply an expression of consciousness itself. And it's possible to actually be that consciousness. You don't have to be that story. When you are that story, you cut yourself off from all of the rest of who you are. And that's all I'm saying. So what's the teaching there? Well, I can tell you what the teaching is that you look for anything that points towards it, right? If I could throw a rock at you and I thought it would work, I'd get on a plane and come over and throw a rock at you, because what the heck, anything works, right? So the teaching is whatever works for the experience, the happening of who you are itself to occur. So whatever does that. right? So I always laugh. I use that example of all of the people out by the pool, and they're all sitting out by the pool and they're talking about what water is, right? And all of a sudden, some wise man or some village idiot, because they're both the same thing, comes along and says, you know what? These guys are having a conversation about something that seems incredibly stupid to me. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to push them in the pool. And then I'm going to ask them, so what is wet? And you know what? They're going to come up smiling because they're going to see that all that talking means absolutely nothing. And you know what wet is? Wet is wet. The famous poet, I believe it was Longfellow, was sitting with a child one day and he said, hey, why is the grass green? And the child looked at him like he was stupid. And he said, it's green because it's green. And we all know that's why grass is green. Now we have scientists that will tell us a whole story about why it's green, right? But come on, you all know the grass is green because the grass is green. And all that story is someone trying to come up with a reason to make you feel better as though there were such a story, because you've all learned that you need a story in order to support whatever other story that you have. So you can spend the rest of your life chasing around after stories to support the other stories that you have. That's one thing you can do. And if you're like me and a lot of other people, after a while, you start to say, well, this is an exercise in stupidity, and not only that, I know there's something deeply wrong. And what's deeply wrong is that you've created a story that gets in the way of you and consciousness itself. And your belief that that's who you are cuts you off from consciousness. What you are is a conduit of consciousness. It's living itself through you. And you have the choice of seeing that or not. End of story. I guess if you have a teaching, that's a teaching. I laugh because the other day, I shared this with Julian. So this is going to be pretend the grumpy old men are talking to each other. Because somebody said to me, hey, Alan, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this thing. It's going to be the Disneyland of spirituality. And my response was, that might be the stupidest thing I ever heard. Can imagine that one over well, right? Well, why is that? Why is that stupid, Alan? Well, because in Alan world, you're going to have a whole amusement park and it's going to have one ride. And it's going to be called Who Am I? That's the only ride there is. The rest of it's a bunch of crap. There aren't a bunch of rides on the spiritual Disneyland. There aren't. There's one. There's only one thing that actually matters in the spiritual journey, and that's to know who you are. That's it. That's the entirety. And that knowing is not intellectual, and it's not the story. You aren't the story. Learning the story is awesome, but there's only one. And see, I said, who am I? What am I? Is another great one. I don't know if you know that the Tibetans use one called Where Am I? That's kind of a fun one too. Any of those things work. Because what it does is it actually induces the question of who am I? And if you can see that who you are is a story that you made up in your mind, and that you continually run around and try to support that and convince everybody that that's who you are, and the likelihood is if you stay there, you get to do that for the rest of your entire life. You may say to yourself, wow, I'm in for a long, boring life. Because if that's your only activity is trying to support that you're the story that you think you are, wow. Now, if you look out there in the world, you can see that's what they do. So the reason that there's all of this inhumanity to humanity, as Julian calls it out, that's just separation, right? So, England doesn't like Argentina, so it goes down and conquers these little things called the Falkland Islands, and everybody in England cheers and everybody in Argentina cries. Okay. What really happened? Nothing. Now, the inhumanity that happened is, I don't know, maybe they killed a few sheep and a couple Argentinians. I'm not entirely sure, but that's what happened. I thought I'd pick an English story today. I mean, the things that the United States does are so many. The list is so long. I would have been confused to pick it. But I remember that the English decided that they wanted those God forbidden islands with 14 sheep on it, that they thought that was important in some way. And I always thought that was the best spiritual story you could tell, because that's the insanity of being separate. So that does happen. Inhumanity happens because we believe we're separate and we act like we are. That's where it comes from. If you want to talk about inhumanity, there'd be no reason to do any of that otherwise. Okay, Paolo. Oh, why is consciousness looking for itself? Isn't that a great question? So, what's the assumption in the question? All right, I'll tell you. The assumption is that something causes consciousness to act like it does. And I know that Julian threw that in there and he knew that already. So just this dirty little secret, that's not a real question, Julian. Anyway, so consciousness acts like consciousness because that's what it does. Why are you looking for your deepest rooting? Because that's what you're doing. At some point in time, if you believe that the entire world is cause and effect, then you're never finished, because every cause has a cause that would precede that. Osho used to call, I think it's called that in the philosophical world, infinite regression, if you want a fancy word for today. The term for today is infinite regression. What that means is that you're caught in a loop looking for the cause of every single thing that happens. That's the movement within consciousness. Why does it do that? Consciousness arises and does what it does. At a certain point, you have to let go of the why and see that our world is not a function of cause and effect. It's all it is an arising within yourself. And who you are isn't this individual being, but rather everything. You are the view from everything, not the view from you. All right. Here you go. I've got a Paolo question, and then I'm going to move on to this other little thing. When we step into our power, is that consciousness doing, or is that the ego weight dropping of us, or is that just the wisdom we carry? So imagine, Paolo, that you and I were out on the dance floor, and we're dancing along, and we're on this beautiful solid floor. And all of a sudden, somebody came along and they said, you know, that floor you're dancing on, it's not really there. If you kind of take a peek, you'll see it's dissolving right in front of your eyes. You're dancing on a floor that isn't really even there. Now, under this dance floor is a 10-foot drop into a swimming pool full of whipped cream. And what happens when the floor dissolves? Well, you collapse through into the swimming pool of whipping cream. I made that up just for you, by the way, Paolo. I knew you'd like whipping cream in the pool. So that's what happens. So when we step into our power, pure power is when you are simply expressed into consciousness itself. So all of your power isn't yours. It's actually the power that consciousness expresses through this thing called the body mind of Paolo. That's what it is. And when that happens, you've fallen through the dance floor and you're now swimming in a pool of whipped cream. That's what's going on. It just collapses. So a lot of time what we do, if you see a lot of what I do, is I try to deconstruct a story that you have. And when I do, at first you replace it with another story. So you start to get used to the fact that these stories, one can replace the other. And that's the dance floor dissolving. As you replace one story with another, that dance floor is dissolving, because pretty soon what happens is you see that all of those stories really don't form a floor. And in the relaxed state, relaxation is key to all of this, because thinking is connecting to stories as though they're real. So what happens is thinking relaxes and the floor falls through. So that's what happens when you step into your power, right? There's no use stepping into any power. You're just simply being danced on the dance floor, right? And then you see the dance floor doesn't exist, and boom, it collapses. And the wisdom then, what wisdom is, Paolo, is speaking from the new place, speaking from the place of the swimming pool with whipped cream. So everybody's going, hey, you know, I'm dancing on this dance floor. It's all scratched up. It's kind of dirty. It's greasy. Everybody's been dancing here for a lot of years. And Paolo's sitting there going, dude, we're in the middle of a swimming pool full of whipped cream. Don't you see it? Now, you and I call that wisdom, but what it really is you speaking from the obvious, right? It is what it is. So in coming home to consciousness itself, which is what you've always been and what you really are, pure awareness expressed as consciousness, when that arrival at that place, when that happens, then the speaking comes from that same place. And that's wisdom. So someone will say, hey, Alan, you carry a lot of wisdom. And I chuckle because I sit here before Satsang and there's not a single thought in my mind. And so I know there's not a lot of content. So if wisdom is content, I don't have any. And if you ask me what I said today, I likely won't remember most of it. And I'm going to remember that I was in a room with all of these people that I love. I'll probably remember that. And I'll remember that the deep caring that moves through the Alan body mind wants to tell everybody, hey, we're sitting in a swimming pool full of whipped cream. I might remember that piece. And that's it. That's wisdom. And there's important words like infinite regression and all this other stuff, you know, cognizing and all of that stuff. And I use those words. I hate them, actually. I wish it were simpler ones. Every time I use a simpler word, it doesn't really cover what I'm trying to cover. So I actually have to teach people, you know, important new words that nobody should ever use, but that's okay. We'll use them until we don't need them. Then we throw them away. So that's how it works. Now, Julian has a really great one, the zone that sports people talk about, the automatic doing of consciousness. I always tell the story about Nijinsky, the famous ballet dancer. And one day they asked him about his dancing because he was quite something. He was a dancer of a kind nobody had ever seen before. And they said, when do you dance best? And he says, I dance best when I'm not there. And all he was saying was the Nijinsky story doesn't dance as well as consciousness when it dances through what looks like Nijinsky. That's all he was saying. And that's what the sports people all point to. So how can brands inset these powerful stories and attract their tribe? So remember, Sabrina, a story is a story. So humans are so arrogant that they believe that the story about them is more powerful than any other story in consciousness. So if nothing else, learn today, not true. Any story that arises from consciousness has the power of any other story that arises from consciousness. It's just that because we believe we're an individual and we believe that we're egoically special, we have a hard time seeing how there would be a more powerful story than that. And yes, I do use the original myth story and I take people back there, but that's because it's so available and it's so easy to find and it's so obvious. But the brand stories that we live within are just as important. So how can brands inset these powerful stories to attract their tribe? No problem. All you have to do is create the story that includes the tribe. So I'll tell a little business story here for a second. There's a company that I worked with. Julian likes this story, by the way. There's a company I worked with in New York. It's the largest parking company in the city of New York, and it's called Icon Parking. Now imagine this, what they do is they run, I don't know, 200 or 300 underground parking lots in Manhattan. So if you've ever been in Manhattan and you look around, you're going to go down the street and you're going to see all these buildings and all of this stuff. And then all of a sudden you're going to come across an opening and you can see that cars can drive in and drive out and they go underground and you park your car. And in Manhattan, in New York City proper, that's a pretty big deal because if you've ever been there, parking is something that you really, really need. So I worked with a company, and that company was the biggest company in Manhattan that did that kind of work. And I came into the room and I said, we're going to create a brand story. And everybody immediately said, well, how could we possibly have a brand story? Because you see what happens in that world is that it's hard to imagine that a parking company has a story. That's just difficult for anyone to imagine. Because what does a parking company do? It sticks cars between two white lines in an underground place. That's what it does. But you see, here's what the reality was. This company had been a container for one of the most marvelous things that happens within the city of New York. And we sat down and I started to talk to them about that. And so what I did is I put them all at a table and I said, tell everybody your original myth story, the most powerful story you can tell about yourself. And of course, at the table, there were Colombians and Guatemalans, and there were Afghanis, and there were Iraqis, and there were, you can imagine, it was what New York looks like. And they began to tell stories about how they came to New York and they didn't have anything. Some of them were doctors and some were engineers. And of course, they couldn't work within the American culture because, you know what, those licenses and certifications weren't recognized in the United States. And so what did they do? They went and got a job. What kind of jobs are available in New York? Well, one of the best ones is parking cars. And so they went to those companies. And pretty soon they found the people that were part of their tribe. And they educated their children and they bought houses and they worked at that company for an entire lifetime. That's what they did. And that became the action that was inherent there. So what was that company about? That company was about being a place where you could come from anywhere and you could function in New York. And not only could you do that, you could create a family, you could do all of that. And pretty soon that started to show up in all of the things they did, because we had poets that were down in the underneath parking cars and writing poetry on the side. And we had photographers and we had all of these beautiful things happening. And what I found out was one of the most interesting things was at Christmas time, the executives had a Christmas party, and it was special, of course, with the white tablecloths and beautiful silver and everything. And down on the bottom of the garage, way out in the corner where it smelled like grease and God knows what else, they had another party. And what that party was about was unfolding a bunch of chairs and putting paper on the table and having the little fold up chairs and tables that went with that. And everybody, all the families, they would make the food from their country and everybody would come. And they would spend that time with themselves and they would show their photography and read their poetry and talk to old friends, play with the kids. Every man and woman was a grandma and grandpa to all the children that ran around. It was just the most beautiful thing that you probably would ever see. And so I got there and I said, well, I guess you guys know me well enough to know which party I'd want to go to. So here I am, the guy that they've hired to completely change the whole culture. And I want to go to the party in the bottom of the dank garage because that's where the story of the company lived. So I begged and I pleaded, and I could speak a little Spanish, and that helped. And I convinced a couple of those folks that I should be able to come to that party. And not only that, I was able to bring 3 or 4 of the executive team to the party, the CEO. And we went to that party and we had the most wonderful thing. You can't even imagine what that party was like, because all of a sudden they had a few of us there, but you know what? We sat on the same chairs. We ate from the same paper plates. It was an awesome experience. We got to participate in what that parking company was really about. And you know, today they don't even have the other party. There's only one party in that company now. It's in the bottom of that dank garage. They haven't moved it. It's on the same tables and chairs. They buy new ones if they need them. And everybody goes to that party. And in fact, a lot of the customers and investors are begging to get into that party. Everybody wants to go to the party in the bottom of the dank garage. So you tell me, how powerful is a story? Does it need to be attached to a person? Because the brand story of Icon, and I proudly consider myself part of that company, is the moment that you walk into that dank garage and sit down at that table, and some beautiful person brings you food that came from, a kitchen, and it's exactly family food from whatever culture that is. And you see people fighting over whether they're going to get, the green sauce or whether the Indian curry from over here. It's like, everybody has their favorite thing. And as in all families, it's a big deal. And that's what that company's about. It's a place you get to do that. So that's how you do it. You see beyond what you think your story is, that's the brand story, and you be who you are, and you figure out, well, what's my brand story look like now? That's how to do a brand story. All right. This is from Dion. Do you think that listening to your consciousness will cost you an opportunity? That's a great question. I would tell you no. And here's why. Is an opportunity to be authentic, live in a bigger way than authenticity itself. Because when you're authentically created or positioned within consciousness, there is no sweeter moment than that moment. And any opportunity that asks you to manage yourself in a different way than that will immediately feel hollow. That will be the way it will feel. And so somebody like me goes to India. I did that when I was 37, and I learned all about these different things, and I go through a process and go through an awakening experience, and I come back to the corporate world, and what I see is that presence is the same thing as a spiritual journey. And I'm like, well, this is cool. I can go teach the spiritual journey in the corporate world. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change a few words because they don't like the spiritual words. So I'm not going to talk about consciousness and awakening and all of that. What I'm going to talk about is presence and leadership, because those are just corporate words for the same thing. So I write a book, and I walk into a company one day that's doing, 13 billion and has 64,000 employees. And they say to me, Alan, we're trying to find the story that is compelling. Great. And what we need to do is we need to develop our business cases so they're that way. And I was a CPA for 40 years, merger acquisition guy. So developing business cases is actually something that I do. And so I said, yeah, I can do that. And they said, great. I'm going to imagine then that our cases are going to be so much better constructed. I said, no, that's not going to happen. I don't know who told you that that's what the output is. Here's what actually happens when you are compelling. You actually are operating from the bottom of your own authenticity. And when compelling hears compelling, it's attracted. And the CFO of that company turned to me and he said, the minute you said that, I intuitively knew it was true. Why hasn't anybody else told me that? And I said, because they think they can deliver an inauthentic version and still be powerful. And I'm here to tell you that if you're compelling, it's not out of inauthenticity that happens. So do you lose an opportunity? An opportunity for what? That's the question. All right. Hey, do you guys want to do a little exercise with me before we finish up today? I've done this one with you before, and I want you to just have a little experience with me. And here's what it looks like. I know that when we look out of our eyes, we see what's out there. So I want everybody to, in a moment here, and I'll tell you when, to close your eyes. And when I do, I'm going to give you a few little inputs, and I want you to bring those on. Okay. So first of all, look out there and see everything that's there. You see all of that out there? Okay. That's called perceiving, by the way. We're just using visual. Now remember, perceiving can happen a lot of ways. Visual is one of them. Auditory is another. Feeling is another, right? And there's even kind of a sensing that's beyond feeling, right? That's what we're going to go play in that pond. So look out there and get a sense of everything that's out there for me. Now everybody close their eyes. All right, now that you have your eyes closed, sit here and with me, perceive the entire world that's out there. Can you sense it? Can you sense the world that is out there? Now, the next thing you want to do is see if you can sense the world and sense yourself within the world at the same time. Can you perceive the world and you in the world all at the same time? Yeah, you got that? Okay, here's the next thing we're going to do. I'm going to have you open your eyes. And what I'm going to ask you to do is stay in the place where you can perceive yourself and everything else at the same time. Don't switch into what happens from your eyes. Let your eyes just open. It'll be there. But stay in the place of sensing the whole thing as you are right now with your eyes closed. Okay, you ready? 1, 2, 3. Softly open your eyes. Okay, can you feel that it's different? You're now sensing the world. That is who you are. That is where you want to hang out. Hang out in that place and see what starts to happen. All that is your sense of existence, your sense of presence that can see you and everything else all at the same time. That's what that is. Right? From there, your authenticity arises. It's from that place. And that's the place that will send you to again and again and again. And at times you're going to come back and believe you are your story. But whenever you do, notice you think you're separate and you're looking through your eyes. If you want to, go back into this place. It's a wonderful place to hang. It's the who you are in a much bigger way than the sense of who you are as an ego body. All right. I've got one last little piece to do, everybody. We always talk of stories, and one of the things I talk a lot about is replacing one story with another. And so I've got a story here, and the reason I wanted to bring this story up is that I posted this story to Facebook the other day. And when I did, I thought of Yasmin and Justine because they have a special kind of energy. And so if you want to step into the energy of those two and you want to switch your story from what yours is to theirs, this story will help you do that. And I want to end with this story today. We'll see if I can get through it, by the way. A farmer had some puppies he needed to sell. He painted a sign advertising the 4 pups and set about nailing it to a post at the edge of his yard. As he was driving the last nail into the post, he felt a tug on his overalls, and he looked down into the eyes of a little boy. "Mister," he said, "I want one of your puppies." "Well," said the farmer as he rubbed the sweat off the back of his neck, "these puppies come from fine parents and cost a great deal of money." The boy dropped his head for a moment, then reaching deep into his pocket, he pulled out a handful of change and held it up to the farmer. I've got 39 cents. Is that enough to take a look? Sure, said the farmer, and with that he let out a whistle. He says, here, Dolly, he called out. Hold on a sec here. And from out of the doghouse and down the ramp ran Dolly, followed by 4 little balls of fur. The little boy pressed his fence against the chain link fence. His eyes danced with delight. As the dogs made their way to the fence, the boy noticed something else stirring inside the doghouse. Slowly, another little ball appeared, this one noticeably smaller. Down the ramp it slid. Then, in a somewhat awkward manner, the little pup began hobbling towards the others, doing the best to catch up. I want that one, the little boy said, pointing to the runt. The farmer knelt down at the boy's side and said, son, you don't want that puppy. He will never be able to run and play with you like the other dogs would. With that, the little boy stepped back from the fence, reached down and began rolling up one leg of his trousers. In doing so, he revealed a steel brace running down both sides of his leg, attaching itself to a specially made shoe. Looking back to the farmer, he said, you see, sir, I don't run too well myself, and he'll need somebody who understands. With tears in his eyes, the farmer reached down and picked up the little pup. Holding it carefully, he handed it to the little boy. How much? Asked the little boy. No charge, answered the farmer. There's no charge for love. So the next time you want to know how to step into a story, step into that one. All right, everybody. I love you. Thank you all for being here today. And I'll see you in a couple of weeks when we do this again. Bye.